perseverance the fruit of grace, not a reward for our cooperation. There is no doubt that perseverance should be seen as a free gift of God. However, rooted in men's hearts is the false belief that it is imparted to each of us according to merit, that is, according as we prove we are not ungrateful for God's initial gift of grace. Now, because this belief is based on the notion that we are able to refuse or accept God's grace when it is offered to us, it can be easily refuted, since we have shown such reasoning to be false. Here, indeed, we have a twofold error. Not only do our opponents claim that by making good use of God's initial grace we deserve other gifts to follow as a reward, they also add that God's grace does not work in us on its own, but that it simply cooperates. As to the first point, it should be clear that the Lord God multiplies his gifts in his servants, and each day bestows new gifts on them. And because the work he has begun in them is pleasing to him, he finds in them cause and occasion to enrich them, and thus to increase them. This is the sense of statements such as, "To him who has, it will be given," or "Since you have shown yourself a faithful servant in small things, I will put you in charge of more." Now there are two failings we should be aware of here. We should never assume from this that man can correctly use God's grace so as to make it effective by his own efforts. Second, no one should claim that the gifts enjoyed by the believer are a reward for rightly employing God's initial grace, as if God's free goodness were not the source of it all. It is true that believers may expect to be blessed when, having made better use of God's gifts, others, newer and greater, will be added daily. Yet I would also argue that the proper use of God's gifts is God's work, and that reward is a free act of his goodwill. This is expressly taught by Paul, who, having written, "It is God who works in us both to will and to do," at once adds that God does both according to his good pleasure, by which he means his unmerited kindness. As for their assertion that having allowed initial grace to do its work, we then cooperate with God, I have this to say. If they mean that having been made obedient to righteousness by God's power, we then willingly consent to be led by his grace, I concede the point. Certainly, when God's grace prevails, prompt obedience follows. But how does this happen if not through the Spirit of God, who, true to himself, nurtures and strengthens the impulse to obey, which from the very first he planted in us? If, on the other hand, they mean that man in his own strength has the capacity to cooperate with God's grace, I judge that to be a pernicious error. They, however, ask pointedly what the apostle meant when he said, "I worked harder than all the rest, yet not I, but the grace of God with me." They claim that so as not to appear too arrogant in preferring himself to all the rest, he tempers his remarks by praising God's grace, but in such a way as to call himself a fellow worker with God. Now it is astounding to see how many otherwise sound people have strained at this gnat. Paul does not say that God's grace worked with him so that he became its partner. Instead, he gives God all the praise for the work done. "It was not I," he writes, "who worked, but the grace of God which helped me." Their entire error is due to the fact that they make do with the usual dubious translation, whereas Paul's Greek text is so plain as to be beyond dispute.